Prince was acting strange. That's what Gilbert told the police later, though strange didn't quite capture it. Prince was always eccentric. That came with a genius. But this was different. In the weeks before his death, Prince kept returning to the vault. Not to record, not to play, just to check. Like he was making sure something was still there, or making sure something was gone. On April 20th, Prince called Gilbert into his office at 10 p.m. He looked exhausted, his eyes sunken and dark. "If something happens to me," Prince said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to go into the vault. Storage room C, third shelf from the bottom. There's a box." Gilbert tried to laugh it off. "Nothing's gonna happen to you, boss." Prince didn't smile. "Promise me." 16 hours later, Prince was dead, and Gilbert was standing in storage room C, staring at a box that should never have been opened. If you want to discover the untold stories that changed music history forever, please subscribe to our channel. The truth about what really happened at Paisley Park that night is something the world needs to hear. Gilbert Martinez had worked security at Paisley Park for 7 years, and in that time, he'd learned that silence was its own language. Prince didn't hire people who talked. He hired people who understood that some things existed beyond words, beyond explanation, in a space where genius did its work undisturbed by the outside world. The compound itself seemed designed for secrecy. 55,000 square feet of studios, rehearsal spaces, and rooms that most staff members never entered. The vault sat at the heart of it all, a climate-controlled archive that held thousands of unreleased recordings, enough material to release an album every year for the next century. Everyone who worked at Paisley Park knew about the vault, but knowing about it and entering it were two entirely different things. In early April 2016, something shifted in the atmosphere of Paisley Park. Prince had always been nocturnal, working through the night and sleeping in scattered intervals. But his patterns became even more erratic. Gilbert would arrive for his evening shift at 6 and find Prince already in the vault. Or he'd make his rounds at 3 in the morning and catch Prince emerging from the archive room with an expression Gilbert had never seen before. Not exhaustion, though Prince was clearly tired. Not frustration, though Prince had always been a perfectionist who drove himself relentlessly. This was something else. This looked like fear. The staff noticed it too, though no one spoke about it directly. Sound engineers mentioned that Prince was listening to old recordings, sessions from the 80s and 90s, material that hadn't been touched in decades. The kitchen staff reported that he wasn't eating, surviving on cups of orange juice and the occasional vegetarian meal that went mostly untouched. And the phone logs showed something even stranger. Prince was making calls late at night to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old collaborators, former band members, people from his past that he'd cut ties with long ago. But it was the trips to the vault that haunted Gilbert. Every night for 2 weeks before his death, Prince made the same journey. Down the purple hallway, past the studios where he'd recorded some of the most iconic music of the 20th century, to the heavy door that required 2 separate keys and a combination only Prince knew. Gilbert watched him disappear inside, sometimes for hours. And when Prince emerged, he looked older somehow, as if whatever waited in that room was draining something essential from him. On April 15th, Prince's private plane made an emergency landing in Moline, Illinois. The official story was the flu, a medical emergency that required treatment before continuing to Minneapolis. But Gilbert was at Paisley Park when Prince returned, and the man who walked through those doors bore little resemblance to the confident performer who'd left for Atlanta days earlier. Prince looked hollowed out, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every step required conscious thought. He went immediately to his private quarters and didn't emerge for 18 hours. When Prince finally appeared, it was late afternoon on April 16th, and he asked Gilbert to take a walk with him around the grounds. This alone was unusual. Prince didn't make small talk. He didn't invite casual conversations. Their relationship had always been professional, built on mutual respect and an understanding that Gilbert's job was to create space for Prince's work, not to intrude upon it. But that day, Prince seemed to need something different. He needed to talk. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, following the path that circled the parking lot and wound through the landscaped areas surrounding the main building. Prince kept his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against a wind that wasn't particularly cold. Finally, he spoke. and his voice carried a heaviness Gilbert had never heard before. Prince talked about legacy, about the difference between what people think they know and what actually exists in the shadows of a life lived publicly. He talked about control, about the music industry's relentless appetite for ownership and profit, and about his decades-long fight to maintain autonomy over his own creations. And then, in a moment that would replay in Gilbert's mind for years to come, Prince stopped walking and looked directly at him. "I've been preparing for something," Prince said, and the words hung in the cold April air like smoke. "I need to know that certain things will be protected, that certain truths will come out when the time is right." Gilbert didn't understand then. He wouldn't understand until it was far too late. Prince continued walking, and the conversation drifted to other topics, surface things that meant nothing. But something had been set in motion, a sequence of events that would culminate 4 days later in a moment that would define the rest of Gilbert's life. April 20th began like any other day at Paisley Park, which meant it began in the middle of the night. Prince was in Studio A, working on something that required absolute privacy. Gilbert made his rounds, checking the perimeter, ensuring that the security cameras were functioning, that the gates were locked, that the small universe Prince had built for himself remained sealed off from the chaos of the outside world. Around 9 p.m., one of the assistants mentioned that Prince wanted to see Gilbert in his office when he had a moment. Not urgently, just when convenient. Gilbert found Prince sitting behind his desk, surrounded by papers that looked like legal documents. Contracts, perhaps, or letters. Prince was wearing his reading glasses, something he rarely did in front of others. And when he looked up, Gilbert saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Prince was 57 years old, but in that moment, he looked ancient. "Close the door," Prince said, and Gilbert complied. The office was small, intimate, filled with gold and platinum records and photographs from 5 decades of performances. Prince gestured to a chair, and Gilbert sat, feeling suddenly uneasy in a way he couldn't articulate. There was a finality to the moment, a sense of something ending that hadn't quite begun. Prince was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk in a rhythm that might have been a song or might have been nervous energy. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a key. Not a modern key, not the kind that opened the electronic locks throughout Paisley Park, but an old-fashioned brass key with an ornate handle and a shaft that looked handmade. He set it on the desk between them. "If something happens to me," Prince said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to go into the vault. Storage room C, 3rd shelf from the bottom. There's a box." Gilbert tried to laugh it off, tried to inject some levity into a moment that felt too heavy, too serious. "Nothing's gonna happen to you, boss." Prince didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply stared at Gilbert with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "Promise me." And what could Gilbert say? What could anyone say in the face of such a direct request from a man who'd given his entire life to his art? Gilbert took the key. He promised. And Prince nodded once, as if a burden had been lifted, though his expression suggested otherwise. They talked for a few more minutes about mundane things, security schedules, an upcoming event. Nothing that mattered. And then Prince dismissed him with a nod, and Gilbert left the office, the key heavy in his pocket, wondering what had just happened and why it felt like goodbye. 16 hours later, Gilbert's phone rang with a call that would shatter everything. It was one of the staff members, her voice high and panicked, saying that something was wrong, that they couldn't find Prince, that someone needed to check the elevator. Gilbert was at Paisley Park within minutes, running through hallways that suddenly felt like a labyrinth, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When he reached the elevator, when he saw what waited there, his mind went blank. The man who'd been larger than life, who'd commanded stages and redefined music itself, lay motionless on the floor, his body small and fragile in a way that seemed impossible. The next hours blurred together in a nightmare of police questions and paramedics and media vans gathering outside the gates like vultures. Gilbert gave his statement multiple times, describing Prince's final days, the emergency landing in Illinois, the exhaustion that had seemed to consume him. But he didn't mention the key. He didn't mention the conversation in the office or the box waiting in storage room C. Something told him that Prince's final request existed outside the official investigation, that it belonged to a different kind of truth. It was after midnight when the police finally left, when the body had been removed and the staff had been sent home, and Paisley Park fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Gilbert stood in the main hallway, the key burning like a coal in his pocket, knowing that he'd made a promise, that breaking it wasn't an option. The vault waited at the end of the purple corridor, its door locked and imposing, and Gilbert realized that he was about to cross a threshold he could never uncross. The vault was exactly what people imagined when they heard the stories. A massive archive of recorded music, organized with a kind of precision that reflected Prince's obsessive attention to detail. Shelves lined the walls, holding thousands of tapes and hard drives and vinyl masters, each one labeled in Prince's distinctive handwriting. The temperature was carefully controlled, the humidity monitored, every precaution taken to preserve material that represented 50 years of uninterrupted creative output. Gilbert had been inside the vault before, but always with Prince, always under supervision. Being here alone felt like trespassing in a sacred space. Storage Room C was smaller than the main archive, tucked away in a corner that most people would never find. Gilbert used the key Prince had given him, and the lock turned with a click that echoed in the silent room. The third shelf from the bottom held exactly what Prince had described. A box. Not large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, made of dark wood with brass corners and a small lock on the front. Gilbert lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight, and carried it to a table in the main archive room. The key Prince had given him fit the lock perfectly, and when Gilbert opened the box, he found himself staring at something that made no immediate sense. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, written on different types of paper, in different handwriting, spanning what looked like decades. Some were typed on letterhead from record companies and legal firms. Others were handwritten on notebook paper or hotel stationery. All of them were addressed to Prince, and as Gilbert began to read, he realized he was looking at a curated collection of the most important correspondence Prince had received throughout his entire career. But it wasn't just fan mail or business correspondence. These letters told a story, a narrative thread that wound through Prince's life like a hidden river. There were letters from Warner Brothers executives in the early 90s, aggressive and threatening, demanding that Prince fulfill his contractual obligations or face legal consequences. There were responses from Prince's lawyers, meticulously documenting every attempt to control his music, to own his name, to turn his art into commodity. There were personal letters, too, from collaborators and friends, expressing concern about Prince's health, his isolation, his increasingly erratic behavior in the years before his death. And beneath all of these, at the very bottom of the box, Gilbert found something that made his hands shake as he lifted it into the light. It was a letter in Prince's own handwriting, dated April 19th, 2016, 2 days before his death. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone specific. It was simply titled, The Truth. Prince's handwriting was small and precise, every word carefully formed, as if he'd known this letter would be his final testimony. Gilbert read it 3 times before the full weight of what he was holding began to sink in. Prince wrote about control, about the decades he'd spent fighting to own his music, to protect his artistic vision from corporate interests that saw him as nothing more than a revenue stream. He wrote about the symbol years, when he changed his name to an unpronounceable glyph as a protest against Warner Brothers' ownership of the name Prince. He wrote about the vault itself, about the thousands of songs he'd recorded and refused to release, because he wouldn't let anyone else control when and how his music reached the world. But then the letter took a turn that Gilbert hadn't expected. Prince wrote about addiction, about the pain that had plagued him for decades, about hip surgeries and years of performing in high heels and the toll that constant touring had taken on his body. He wrote about prescription painkillers, about doctors who'd enabled his dependency, about a pharmaceutical system that prioritized profit over patient welfare. And he wrote about the final weeks of his life, about realizing that he'd lost control not just of his body, but of his ability to stop, about the terror of knowing that the very thing he'd taken to manage pain was now the thing that would kill him. The letter was brutally honest, stripping away the mythology that surrounded Prince to reveal a human being who'd made mistakes, who'd struggled, who'd fought against forces both external and internal, and had finally run out of strength to keep fighting. But it was also defiant. Prince wrote about his legacy, about the music that waited in the vault, about his determination that future generations would know his work on his terms, not filtered through corporate interests or media narratives. He'd spent his entire life fighting for control. And even in death, even in this final confession, he was asserting his right to shape his own story. At the end of the letter, Prince had written instructions, specific directions about which materials in the vault should be preserved, which recordings should eventually be released, which collaborations represented his truest artistic vision. He'd essentially created a roadmap for his musical legacy, a guide that would ensure his work continued to reach people long after he was gone. And he'd entrusted this knowledge to Gilbert, a security guard who'd never asked for the responsibility, but who now carried the weight of Prince's final wishes. Gilbert sat in the silence of the vault, surrounded by decades of unreleased music, holding a letter that explained everything and changed nothing. Prince was dead. The genius was gone. And all that remained was the work, the art, the massive catalog of songs that Prince had protected so fiercely during his life. Gilbert understood then why Prince had been returning to the vault in those final weeks. He hadn't been checking to make sure something was still there. He'd been saying goodbye. For 8 years, Gilbert kept Prince's letter private. He fulfilled the basic instructions, working with Prince's estate to ensure that certain recordings were preserved properly, that the vault's contents were cataloged and protected. But he didn't share the letter itself, didn't reveal the full depth of Prince's final confession. Some knowledge felt too intimate, too personal to expose to public scrutiny. Prince had lived his entire life in the spotlight, every relationship and creative decision dissected by media and fans. In death, Gilbert wanted to give him the privacy he'd never had in life. But time changes perspective, and as the years passed, Gilbert began to feel the weight of his silence differently. Prince's music continued to inspire new generations. His fight for artistic control became even more relevant as streaming platforms and digital distribution transformed the industry. The questions he'd raised about ownership and autonomy and the price of genius resonated louder with each passing year. And Gilbert realized that by keeping Prince's final letter secret, he might be denying the world the very thing Prince had wanted them to understand. The letter wasn't just about addiction or pain or the pharmaceutical industry. It was about the cost of greatness, about what happens when talent and ambition collide with systems designed to exploit rather than nurture. It was about a man who'd spent 5 decades creating art that changed culture itself, and who died alone in an elevator because the same systems that profited from his genius had failed to protect his humanity. Prince's story wasn't just his own. It was the story of every artist who'd fought for control, every creative person who'd struggled against forces that sought to diminish their vision, every human being who discovered that success and suffering often walked hand in hand. Today, the vault continues to release material, carefully curated albums and box sets that give fans access to Prince's vast catalog of unreleased work. Each release is a reminder of his incredible productivity, his refusal to be limited by commercial expectations or industry timelines. The music is extraordinary, spanning genres and decades, demonstrating a creative restlessness that never allowed Prince to settle into comfortable patterns. Every new release confirms what those who knew him always understood. Prince wasn't just a musician. He was a force of nature, channeling something primal and essential through his art. But for Gilbert, every release carries a different weight. He knows what Prince wanted the world to understand, the message he tried to leave behind in that letter, written 2 days before his death. The music is important, yes. The artistic legacy matters. But so does the truth about the man who created it. The human being who struggled and suffered and fought until he couldn't fight anymore. Prince's final request wasn't just about preserving his recordings. It was about ensuring that people understood the full cost of the art they loved, the price paid by the person who gave them so much beauty and joy and transcendence. The box sits in Gilbert's home now, the letter carefully preserved, protected from light and moisture and the passage of time. Sometimes he takes it out and reads it again, remembering that night in the vault, the weight of the key in his pocket, the moment he opened storage room C and found himself holding Prince's final testimony. He wonders if he's done the right thing by keeping it private for so long. He wonders what Prince would think about how his legacy has unfolded, about the ongoing legal battles over his estate, about the way his music continues to reach new audiences who never saw him perform live. But mostly, Gilbert remembers that last conversation, that walk around Paisley Park, when Prince talked about legacy and control, and the difference between what people think they know and what actually exists in the shadows. Prince understood that truth is complicated, that human beings contain multitudes, that the stories we tell about famous people rarely capture the full reality of their lives. He wanted something different. He wanted people to see him completely, in all his genius and struggle and humanity. And he trusted Gilbert to help make that happen. The world knows Prince through his music, through performances that redefined what was possible on a stage, through an artistic vision that refused to be contained by conventional boundaries. But Gilbert knows him differently. He knows the man who stayed up all night in the vault, listening to old recordings, saying goodbye to a life's work. He knows the person who wrote a letter confessing his deepest struggles 2 days before he died. He knows the human being behind the icon. And that knowledge is both a privilege and a burden he'll carry for the rest of his life. In the end, maybe that's what Prince wanted most. To be remembered not just as a genius, but as a person who fought for what he believed in, who struggled with demons both internal and external, who created beauty out of pain and left behind a legacy that transcends any single moment or achievement. The box in Gilbert's home represents that complete picture, the full truth that Prince wanted preserved. And someday, when the time is right, that truth will emerge from the shadows, just like Prince planned, just like he always intended. Because even in death, even in that final request to a security guard he trusted, Prince was still fighting for control, still shaping his own narrative, still ensuring that the story would be told his way. The vault continues to guard its secrets, releasing them slowly, carefully, in accordance with the vision Prince laid out in his final days. And Gilbert continues to hold the key, both literally and figuratively, to understanding what it all meant. The music will live forever. The performances will continue to inspire. But the truth, the real truth about who Prince was and what he wanted the world to know, waits patiently for the moment when it can finally emerge into the light.